Welcome everybody here. Thank you so much for being with us. It's such a pleasure to see so many friends here with us, so many friendly faces, old friends, some new friends here as well. We have about an hour now for an informal conversation with the MAVA president, André Hoffmann, who all of you know, I believe. We're going to be talking about his relationship to nature and its protection, COVID recovery, business as a force for good, leadership, MAVA's closing, and many other topics as we have time for. Just to get a quick sense of who we have with us, I wanted to launch this poll. Please fill out your answer there just to get a sense of who's here, whether you're a MAVA grantee, a fellow funder, a board member, or a family member, or other kind of friend. Let's just see who we have with us. We have the majority, as you would expect, about 3/4 of you are MAVA grantees, our very close partners. Thank you so much for all of your excellent work. We have some fellow funders here with us. We have some MAVA board members and Hoffmann family members. Welcome, everybody. And then some other kinds of friends that are with us here that gives us a good sense of who's showed up with us here today. Thanks for being here. We asked you to send some questions in advance if you had any. We've tried to incorporate those questions into what will happen during the conversation. If you have additional questions as we go along, please write your question in the chat box. Paul Gros from MAVA, the Mediterranean director, is going to be keeping on top of the chat box and the questions so that she can pull some of those out, and we'll leave time at the end, the last 15 minutes or so, to pick up on any questions that you have that we haven't been able to get to yet. If we're not able to answer all of your questions, we'll make sure you get answers to those later on by following up in writing. Just by way of introduction, even though he needs no introduction, we're talking with André today. He's the MAVA president. He took over as president of MAVA in 2010 from his father, our founder, Dr. Luc Hoffmann. He is the vice chair of Roche Pharmaceuticals, the business that was started by his grandfather, and he sits on many different boards and advisory councils, both private and nonprofit sectors. And just to name a few of the latter category, he's the president of the Tour du Valais. He's the chair of the Capitals Coalition. He's a member of the advisory board for the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, the Luc Hoffmann Institute, and many others. I won't go through the whole list or we won't have time for anything else. So if you all have speaker view on, André should pop up on your screen now. André, if you're ready, let's get going. I'd just like to start by asking you, where does your passion from nature come from?
Thank you very much, Lina, for this incredibly elogious starting. I mean, I feel a little bit of a, I know most of you have read comics, and one of the comics that we like in France is Astérix. And Astérix has a friend called Obélix, who is a big fat guy, and he fell into the potion magique when he was a young boy, and that's why he's strong. I fell into conservation. I fell into the love of nature because my father introduced that to us. And so for me, it was always a little bit of an absolute obvious thing to do. So it's not a question of loving nature. It's not a question of just thinking it's beautiful, which it is, or culturally important. It's also clearly the life support system on Earth. We cannot expect having a happy humanity without a nature that functions. And therefore, this notion of trying to separate it as a hobby or separate it as a passion or trying to distinguish it or describe it as being something that one likes is, I think, completely irrelevant. We all depend on nature. Nature is our mother. Without going into something too esoteric, without nature, there is no life on Earth. And therefore, we need to make sure that we preserve it, not only for the sake of it, but also for our own sake. So I will send the question back and I will say, no, it's not passion. It's very logical thinking that convinces me that we need to do everything we can to protect nature. I was incredibly lucky to be born into a family which always valued nature at a very high level. In fact, I even grew up in a nature reserve in the Camargue, the Tour du Balai you just mentioned. But I also was born in a family controlling a big company, in fact, the largest pharmaceutical company on the planet now. And that gave me, at an early stage, an opportunity to look at different types of issues, but all of them centered around humanity. I mean, we're talking about patients, or we're talking about visitors on the planet, but we are all part of the same humanity. And therefore, taking interest for one is very difficult to do without taking interest for the other.
Thanks. Well, let's go right into talking about COVID. It's the big issue of the day. It's on the top of all of our minds. And as everyone on this call is already aware, we now know that biodiversity plays a huge role in causing this current and similar pandemics, and plays a role in our health overall, but it also has a role to play in how we rebuild from this sort of a pandemic. So I'm going to start with a question from Assad from SPNL in Lebanon, which is, how do you see the way forward to both stop the bankruptcy of nature and avert a global economic meltdown at the same time, while respecting human rights and dignity, all wrapped in?
Well, thank you for the question, which is obviously just happens to contain absolutely everything on the planet in it. So I'm going to give myself a bit of time to reply to this one. It strikes me that the current crisis has demonstrated that the current model is not fit for purpose. MAVA has for many years, with the help of all our partners, tried to address the issue of what we identified as the hotspot in the whole chain. Where do we do well? Where do we not do well? And conservation, nature, habitat loss, biodiversity loss is a clear example of that. The fact that we've had this crisis has made that even more important than it has before. So the current sorry state of affairs is not linked only on the loss of, on the arrival of the virus. It's also linked in general to the weakness of the system in which we are. And it strikes me that if you want to reconstruct the system, we're going to have to introduce a certain amount of resilience. We're going to have to introduce a certain amount of resistance to what's happening. And in order to be able to do that effectively, we are going to have to sort of introduce the complexity of our system. And that complexity is something that we will need to look at time after time. I think we can simplify all this in a very simple expression. It's a very simple definition. Specialization has something to do with the short term. Specialization has something to do with the satisfaction of the immediate need rather than the long-term thinking. So the more specialized we become, the weaker we are. If we really want to make sure that we develop a system that allows us to maximize stability and resilience of our humanity on the planet, we're going to have to increase the level of complexity. We're going to have to increase diversity. And if we want to rebuild something, we are going to have to do that in a simple way. And the solution provided by nature, what we call NBS, nature-based solution, actually provide us with a simple way of doing that. If you look at social systems at the moment, we are hit by the most humongous job losses we've ever experienced, especially in the US. And I think we need to construct new jobs which will allow us to add value to humanity. The equipment of the whole diversity model will allow us to create new jobs in biodiversity conservation. This is a very simple nature-based solution. If I take as example energy, for instance, energy, until now we have specialized into using very efficient fossil fuels who are giving us a lot of energy with a little input. In the future, we're going to have to go to renewable source of energy, and solar and winds are the two most obvious examples. And these are going to require a lot of investment, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of jobs. We are going to need people to install all this equipment, and in particular in houses. So I think that the future of a resilient and well-functioning humanity goes through reappropriating nature and using nature in a way that can help us to get to the prosperity that we all aspire to.
So as we rebuild, how do we ensure that we don't revert to the economy of December 2019?
But I think it's very important to understand that the economies of before 2019 or December 2019 was already in deep trouble. We all knew that. We had deemed it the super year for nature. We were going to sort of have the CBD conference in China. We were going to have the COP24 23 of the climate agreement in Glasgow. All these things were going to help us to try to create, with the help of the Sustainable Development Goals, a more stable and sustainable system. This obviously has accelerated. We have now an opportunity to build things differently. And the only way to really make sure that we continue to deliver in that respect is to continue what we did before this crisis, but do it in a much more self-assured and loud way. And here, of course, I have to call on all the partners of MAVA who have done such a fantastic job at pushing this agenda at a time when most people did not really understand what we were talking about. Today, it's obvious for all to see. Our system is not fit for purpose. Human health, not just health, but human health, one health in the broader sense, depends on a well-functioning ecosystem. And we now have an absolute evident demonstration. What more do we need? If you go back to what was the situation in December 2019, we're just not going to be able to get out of this. So here we have a way of accelerating the changes that are needed. And I know that we're going to be able to make it. Perhaps I can just add the fact that companies in general, and we're going to talk again about the role of businesses and the role of governments, but the fact that businesses have been so suddenly taken by surprise by a complete slowdown of the economy has encouraged them to go back to the legislature and to the governments and to ask them, can you help us? And governments have been amazingly united into actually providing help. They've not been united into how to do it, but they've all been willing to sort of come and help. And so for me, one of the leverage effect, and we are working on that actively within MAVA, one of the way of using this situation is to try to impose some green conditionality on the bailouts that governments are proposing to the industry in the broader sense. So, for instance, yes, let's refinance airlines, but let's ask them to emit less CO2. Yes, let's refinance the corner shop, but let's ask it to be better insulated, better functioning, with a shorter amount of goods that move, etc. So we have an opportunity, a very specific point where we can actually have an impact. And when I say we, I mean we collectively, not just MAVA, of course. So it is MAVA's role, I think, going forward to influence policy and decision makers to help them to take the right decision according to the sort of work we've been doing since the beginning of MAVA.
So as we think about the collective work that we support at MAVA, what for you are some of the ways that MAVA partners can engage in rebuilding better?
I think that what we've done until now is an important issue. We need to protect pockets of biodiversity, and we've done that very efficiently. We've done that, for instance, in the Camargue, we've done that in Prespa, we've done that in Mauritania, in the Bon d'Arguin, we've done that in a number of different geographies, and we need to continue to do that, and to do that in the most possible sustainable way. Then we need to think about new ways of using this biodiversity in a way that is not only satisfying the current needs, but in the long term. We need to create that circular economy we've been talking about for a long time. And we need to do quite a lot of this. There's also the notion of new ways of thinking, trying to introduce different ways of moving forward the agenda when we are confronted to development in the one planet system. And there I see a couple of good ideas coming through. But I want to re-emphasize that point. The partners of MAVA did a good job before the crisis, so that crisis has to be used as an accelerator. And that's a very important point. We should not be checked out of course just because we have this virus controlling the planet. I mean, the fact that we were completely unable to prepare ourselves to that crisis, which was obviously predictable, strikes me that we obviously have a system, I'm sorry, it's the third time I say it, but we obviously have a system that's not fit for purpose.
This brings us to business as a force for good. You're a very vocal advocate for business as a force for good. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means to you and how you help do that at Roche?
Well, I would separate the two questions, if I may. The first part, how can business help? I mean, I think we have to sort of open our eyes and realize that the whole prosperity created for humanity is created by the entrepreneurial phenomenon. You know, you take something, you transform it, you sell it, and you make a margin, and that margin helps to finance all sorts of things. So the good old way used to be you make money first, and then you distribute the money to society through taxes and dividends and salaries. And the society then goes about to repair all the damages that have been created in the value creation business. Obviously, it's absurd. We need to make sure that companies contribute to prosperity, to the wealth of all of us, in a way which does not damage either the social or the natural environment. And so business as a force for good is to try to make people realize that companies can be part of the solution and not only part of the problem, which they have been until now. And now that's something I can obviously share with all NGOs I happen to be involved with. NGOs are not necessarily the right ones, and business are not necessarily the bad ones. You know, there is a divide, yes, there's a place where you make money and a place where you spend the money. But if you really want to introduce sustainability, if you really want to talk in the long term, everybody has to be sustainable. An old friend of mine used to say, you cannot be green if you are in the red. It's absolutely impossible to imagine a sustainable project if that particular project does not throw some positive cash flow at some stage. Now, I'm not saying that the cash flow is the most important one, certainly not. But without it, there is no long-term thinking. And I think that's an important trade-off that one has to make. If I come back to this notion of before of specialization towards diversity, if the whole emphasis of business is to produce short-term value maximization, we will find ourselves in a situation where we sell the future to guarantee the present. And that increases the fragility of the system at a time when there are more and more challenges being thrown at it. So resilience is what matters, and more businesses are starting to realize that business as a force for good is not just a slogan, but it is in fact a recipe for survival. If you overexploit natural resources, you are going to, when I say natural resources, so natural resources, but also social ones, and I think we've seen a couple of good examples in the recent past, you're going to hit a wall, especially in the one planet system. So business as a force for good is let entrepreneurial thinking help humanity to come out of this blind alley in which we are at the moment.
Can you say a few words about how that's working in the Roche context?
Pharmaceutical businesses have an incredibly important role to play, and that again has been sort of underlined by the COVID crisis. The biggest problem facing pharmaceutical companies is not the fact that they have to be profitable, but it's the fact that they have to make whatever solution they come up with accessible to the biggest number. So we need to make sure that we give to patients across the planet access to medicine. Our opportunity, rather, is not to just try to keep people out of disease. It's also trying to make sure that people who do not have a fair chance and a fair access to health system also have a way of looking at this. So for Roche, we are not just selling drugs. We are not just a pill manufacturer. We are a partner to health system to try to make sure that the system itself satisfies more and more patients or treats more and more patients and does that in a way that is fair and equitable. So we want to be able to run the business by making best use of the human, the social, and the environmental capital as well. Obviously, as I said before, if there is no profit, then there is no business either. So there has to be a profit, and some people, in particular in this crisis moment, find that difficult to accept. But whatever solution we can provide, we can only provide because we are sufficiently profitable to reinvest into research. So the journey of Roche has started 12 years ago when we started at board level a committee. That committee was a sustainability and governance committee, which I chair. And in that committee, we've put in place a certain element of transparency in order to make sure that we can have build some trust with our patients. So the key words, I think, are transparency and predictability. We need to be able to make sure that people outside of our committee and outside of the company realize that what we are trying to do is to satisfy the needs of the patient. And we do that in as much a transparent position as possible. So we started reporting on all the dimensions we could think of, so measuring impact and not just financial returns. And we've been doing that for the last 10 years. We won awards and representation for transparency, but it is now absolutely embedded into the company. When we take a decision about what it is we're doing, we don't just look at the financial return, at the financial possibilities, but also at their impact. And that gives me an opportunity to talk about one of our partners, the Capital Coalitions, which I think is doing absolutely frontier work, pioneer work, in trying to give us a metric which will allow us to measure not only financial numbers, but also impact. And impact means not just environmental impacts, or not just the fact that we're destroying the planet because we want to transform it into money, but also social systems. And it's been a well-known tradition that you've created wealth by exploiting other people, and that's something we need to stop. It's not sustainable.
Right. Let's move on to leadership. You are a big advocate for developing leaders in leadership. Can you say something about what kind of leaders the world needs today, and what will we need tomorrow? How do we prepare today for what we're going to need tomorrow?
Perhaps again a step back and commenting on the COVID crisis. This is not a failure of a system, or this is not only a failure of a system. It's mostly a failure of leadership. The people who have led us through this crisis have not done it well. We all knew that a pandemic was on its way. People have been talking about this for quite a long time. Politicians were far too late to react, and they reacted in a way which is very disorganized. We don't have a united view about this. The only body who could have sort of provided guidance, the WHO, has been completely emasculated by a couple of its members who have sort of tried to undermine it at all levels. We hear of countries acquiring stocks of products, either tests or therapies in such big quantity, just in order to make sure that there's not enough for everybody, but just enough for them. And this sort of leadership does not take into account the globality of the problem. It just looks at specific interests. Now, I'm not sure that these are bad people. It's just that they've been told that the only thing that really matters is the satisfaction of the moment. We think short term. So we need to move into a different approach where we're going to be able to take into consideration, before taking every decision, not only the immediate results, but also the impact on different things. And I'm coming back to the same thing, the three capitals, human, natural, and financial. We need to make sure that the leaders of tomorrow take a view which is a little bit more long-term than the one that we have at the moment. And for this, I initiated, outside of MAVA, a program at INSEAD, which is called the Global Institute for Business and Society. For those of you who don't know it, INSEAD is one of the leading business school. Why should I say that? It's the leading, because that's where I went to. The leading business school. And it has until now done the same thing as all the other business schools. And you are being taught that the best way to manage a company is to maximize shareholder return. Now, we all know that that's not the case. Measuring financial flows is not enough to describe the efficiency, efficacy, or whatever of a company. A company has a much larger footprint than its balance sheet or its profit and loss account. And that's what we need to work more at. We need to make sure that the people who come into the managerial responsibility, in particular in business, take conscience of the impact they're having. And so the idea of saying, I'm doing no harm because my business is just making money, is not good enough anymore. We need to restore, we need to replenish, we need to regenerate. So today I'm trying to advocate as a leader for big corporation, or indeed as for in public administration as well, not just the satisfaction of what's happening today, but we need to give back to the system. We need to regenerate what the system that has given us so much until now. So today, I'm advocating for net contribution and no longer just the stable contribution. I mean, the stable contribution would be brilliant, but most of the companies are in fact in negative territory, and it's time for them to go back into positive.
I have a question from Maimouna Abdali Salek from Biodiversité in Mauritania, who asks, do you have any advice for MAVA partners on how to be more effective in our work?
Well, I'm delighted to have a question from Mauritania. Mauritania is a country I really like very much, and I spend a lot of time. In fact, the saddle that you see here behind me, this is a camel saddle coming from Iwik, which I look at with great nostalgia quite often. I think that the key to all our partners, irrespective of Mauritania or not, is that they have to be aligned with the needs of the systems around them. Being right is not enough. You need to be able to carry people along. You need to be able to advocate in the right forum, in the right place, at the right time. The key to success for an NGO is to make yourself indispensable. And the best way of making yourself indispensable is to stick to what your original argument was. You don't need to go with the flow. You need to stick to your original belief. So if your idea is to get into a situation where we can protect one particular species, well, then go on doing that, because that's a massive contribution to biodiversity. The idea of doing what we call donor's drift, where you just wait for the donor to tell you what it is you're doing, that's not going to work. People want well-differentiated approaches to these things. So my advice would be to say that if you have identified a situation which needs addressing and you're addressing it successfully, then keep at it. Don't try to change just in order to satisfy any potential donors.
Great, thanks. I love that. Being right is not enough. We need more along with that. So I'd like to move now into the last organized section that we have, which talks about MAVA's closing, which I know a lot of our partners on the line are keen to hear your thoughts on. Yeah. I suppose the number one question, we have two key questions. The next one will come that many partners asked, in particular Jean-François Roubin from the Maison de la Rivière. You and your family have done so much for nature over the years, and the challenges are as big as ever. Why is MAVA closing?
Well, this is a fundamental question we can answer in many different ways. I'm just going to tell you the truth, because I think that's the best way of dealing with these things. It's closing, first and foremost, because my father had the vision and the foresight of understanding that he didn't want to create himself a monument that would outlive him. MAVA is not a mausoleum where we continue to cherish the memory of my father just because he was the founder. MAVA has gone on to do the work he intended to do. He had set down a date which would be the end of operation, and this is where we're going to. And the idea of asking me as his son to mimic his doing, to constantly double guess what he would have done if I had been there, if he had been there with me, is clearly an artificial situation which does not correspond to reality. I am deeply grateful to him to have entrusted MAVA to my two sisters and I, and we are going to do the best that we can do outside of MAVA, just as much as we did it within MAVA. MAVA is not going to continue, and that's a deliberate attempt at trying to separate the inheritance of my father from what we are doing in today's world. And I think it's important to understand that. We all are, of course, completely passionate by nature. I mean, those of you who know my two sisters know that in their respective foundation, they are doing some great work which has to do with environment, which has to do with nature, and which has to do with the limits of the planet, which is something we're all confronted with. So I think it's important to understand that they all have, I and my sisters have answers to this question, which are not the same ones as what MAVA is. So there will not be a MAVA 2.0. That will not happen. And we will continue our journey doing other things with probably other people. And I think it's important to really understand that. We will not pursue the same set of priority. Biodiversity protection and protected area work in general has been very successful thanks to you, all our partners, but it is not something we're going to focus on. And I think it's important to understand that. And by the way, this is not a surprise. We've told you a long time ago that we're going to stop. And we've actually set up a program which allows you to identify how you can reinforce the way you function post-MAVA. I really do think that it's time, and thank you, Linda, for giving me the opportunity to do that. Yeah, I really do think it's time that we say that absolutely unequivocally. The amount of money, I think it's more than 50 million Swiss francs, we've invested into helping you to develop after us is because we mean it. There is not going to be a MAVA 2.0, and MAVA will stop there. I don't know how I could reply to Jean-François much more clearly than this. François, it's important that you realize that the future will have to be without us. There you go.
Thank you, André. So when you look at all of the years that MAVA has been doing things, and particularly this last phase where we've been working so intensively towards some specific outcomes and results, what are some of the things or one thing that makes you the most proud when you think of what MAVA has been doing?
Having been a witness of the last 10 years, I can tell you the MAVA of today is a trillion years ahead of what it was 10 years ago. For me, the real legacy, and we're talking about the inheritance of my father, for me, the real legacy is to be able to create a cohort of people who are willing to continue to face these challenges going ahead. We have helped, and I don't think it's immodest to say that, we have helped a whole generation of conservation leaders who understand leadership in the way we discussed it before, to enter into the conservation field and to make a significant difference in what conservation is all about. We don't preserve nature because it's beautiful, although it is. We conserve nature because we need it, because it's part of our living sphere. It's as we said before, the life support system on Earth, and to be able to do this consistently in the right geographies, we need people like you. And for me to put the key under the mat is only possible because I know that you guys are there and you guys are going to continue to do the right thing. With other partners, with other federations, but you are our legacy. And I feel this very strongly every single time I have the privilege of meeting one of you guys in the field. This is, the world will not change just because philanthropy pushes money into it. The world will change because people are going to make a difference. And so if you have been able to light a couple of candles, if you've been able to light a couple of fuses and to make sure that the world is better looked after, I would be very proud of this. That for me would look like success. And at the moment it does, because a lot of you guys have gone on to do things which can only be described as admirable. So thank you. Our legacy is you.
Excellent, thanks. I have a question from Michael Kamps from GOB Menorca, who asks whether you have any thoughts on how conservation organizations can attract funding.
So that's an absolutely it's a question on which I've spent quite a lot of time thinking. I participated twice to a conference called the Business of Conservation. How can you business as a force of good, how can you bring positive cash flows to conservation? And I can see at the moment our list of solutions is very, very small. If you want to protect a beautiful place, protected a reserve, a nature reserve, a park somewhere, so far really only tourism has been part of the solution. You select a couple of people, and I insist on about select because of course you don't want mass tourism, you want high-end type of tourism, and that can create a sort of positive cash flow, which sadly often doesn't stay in the reserve but goes somewhere in the city in the bank account. So at the moment, the only way we can address this is this notion of the distinction between public good and private good. Difficult to generate an income for a private organization by using other people's ownership. The example is the example of the tuna. The last tuna fished in the Mediterranean will make the fishermen rich and everybody else is poor. And so how do we translate that to the funding model of NGOs? We need, as we said before, to make sure that the issue you're trying to support is an issue that really matters. I think that in the long term, philanthropy cannot be the solution because it's too small, there's not enough money around, and B, it's not sustainable. At some stage, as we see with MAVA, the funding will stop and you will have to work out something else. Now, we can hope that there is an ongoing generations of foundation and funders who will come in to provide more fresh money, but that's a bit of a risky thing to do. I mean, it might well be that this is not it's not a really stable way of constructing. So I do hope that society will realize the importance of nature. And I come back to what we were saying before. We need to put a value to it so that we can find a societal way of funding this. So my advice would be, don't focus just on philanthropy, try to find an institutional solution. And I'm afraid that very often means try to talk to governments, which for a non-governmental organization is a bit difficult to do.
I have one more question for you, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience. I've seen lots and lots of them coming through, so we'll try to leave time for that. So the last question is, as we approach 2022, when MAVA will stop funding and we're going to end, what does success look like?
Well, I touched on it early on about, what are we going to leave behind, and who are the people we're going to leave behind, and how they're going to be able to make a difference. But in terms of definition, of course, success looks like natural system which is reinforced and which has a certain amount of independence towards decision makers. We need to reevaluate the contribution of natural system to our presence on the planet. This is not a question of, as we said before, nature bad, the rest good, or the opposite. It's a question of all collectively being able to move the needle. So the success for MAVA will be to have made a lasting contribution to the prosperity of humanity into the place in which we were. The reason we protect fishes in West Africa is not because we want the fishes to survive. It's because we want the result of their fisheries to be shared equally among everybody in a sustainable manner for the long term. So the impact on local systems is an important one. And for me, success would be that MAVA is recognized as somebody who's not necessarily protecting nature against people, but somebody with some institution which will help to protect nature because of people and with people. And that's a major difference with a number of other foundations. We've always integrated local partners. We've always integrated all the people who are listening today. And I think that's a very important contribution. We are not a donor which comes in because they know better. We are a donor who comes in because we want to do things together. And that for me is very important.
And just a follow-up comment on that, can you say something about the community we're trying to build?
Yes, I mean, like-minded people who work together for the sort of targets we just defined, to create a community. And I was talking before about the efforts that MAVA is doing to create some sort of sustainability after our departure. The best way of doing this is to create a group of partners who can work together and who can continue to work together once MAVA per se is no longer there. I cannot give any specific example just now, but it strikes me that there's an awful lot of example where our outcome action plans, in every single region, have brought people together who did not really talk so much before, and who have now a common vision of what is needed to protect the systems. And I'm deliberately trying not to use environment all the time, because it's more than that. It's just the way things articulated function. And the rebuilding post-COVID will be made by people who are able to put nature and natural solution in the front. And these people have to have the flexibility to be able to understand that this is not just about saving one bird or saving one wetland. It's about more than that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm going to invite Paul to come on now and introduce some of the questions. I see there's lots and lots of them that have come through on the chat. So Paul is going to let us know who's going to ask their questions.
Thank you, Linda, and good afternoon, everybody. And indeed, André's discourse and enthusiasm has inspired a wealth of questions. So I'm trying to organize this all. And let's start, let's say women first. And I'm going to call on the question on leadership by Grace Owen. Grace from Common Purpose. Grace, I'm going to unmute you, but you will need to unmute yourself as well in order for us to hear you.
Lovely to see everybody. So good to see so many familiar faces from the Academy and the forums and all the work we're doing on leadership. So André, thank you so much for all that you shared. My question is, what leadership style and core skills will be needed for this reconstruction of the system, so that it is fit for purpose for all of humanity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. Okay, I can talk to you about what would be the ideal situation, and then we can talk about what will probably happen. I mean, today, the idea of making a major system change on the scale that we are contemplating can only be possible if we can co-create it all together. We need partnership, we need constant exchange, and we need to make sure that decisions are not put down top-down, but that they come from a much broader, diverse base. You know, I'm thinking of this model of the manager as an impresario. You help people who are working with you to develop the skills they have, and to collectively work in small teams towards a common purpose. What is likely to have to happen, because we are in a desperate situation in many places, is this emergency work, which is not very compatible with co-creation. I think we're going to have to go for an intermediary phase where leaders who have the right capacity at identifying what is needed will have to emerge. On one side, I'm quite happy about that, because I think a lot of the old leaders should go home now. They've done enough damage. But on the other side, I know that stability and long-term success will depend on making sure that as many as possible people push in the same direction. So we really do need this cohort effect, this group effect. But in an emergency, these things are more difficult to establish. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate the scale of the problem in front of us. I mean, this is gigantic. And in big situations, in big crises that humanity has known, traditionally, a couple of people have emerged. But it would be better if they didn't. Will they be able to? I don't know.
Let's continue with a question from Patricia Zurita from BirdLife International. I'm unmuting you. And this is the start of a couple of questions on the green recovery post-COVID.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much. Hi. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and thanks so much for the wisdom. So there seems to be a lot of interest about setting up and resetting the system into and using the stimulus packages after the crisis for a green recovery. We just hosted the first of our webinar series on Wednesday, and we had more than 600 people signing up. The question for you was, what do you think are the key ingredients, number one? And number two, one of the big problems that resetting the system is facing is the entrenched subsidies that are already there, that are, as you said before, are destroying nature already. How do we turn that around? So what are those creative ways that can help us truly make sure that the resetting of the system happens?
Well, I mean, the green solutions, or the greening of the economy, or the green infrastructure, you know, there are many ways we can describe this. It will need two reasons why it would be preferred. One is simplicity, and the other one is cheapness. The idea of introducing a solution based on nature should be based on efficacy and not just on emotional preference. Yeah? So using a wetlands to purify water is at least as efficient as a retreatment plan, and definitely much cheaper and much easier to put in place. What it does entail is more labor. And labor is something that we have been taught over the years to make sure that we minimize as much as possible, because labor is supposed to be expensive. In the new world, we're realizing that people out of labor are just as complicated as people in labor, so we need to keep them in labor. And situations which are less technologically advanced and therefore perhaps appearing less efficient have been left aside. And I think that's a major mistake. Now, how do we convince investors to do that? I think that has a lot to do with demonstration of metrics, which will give you a clear mention what it is that is working and what isn't working. So we need to do a serious work on identifying the costs of the different solutions. I don't know if in your seminar you had the opportunity to talk about the valuation of different capitals, but I think that for me is an approach that has a lot to offer. The cost to a social system can be much bigger than the benefit of a technological solution.
I'd like to complete this question by the very interesting take of Vinit Rishi from Oak. I'm going to unmute you, and it's about the South-North divide.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And no, André, I haven't left you a very interesting intervention, so thank you for everything you've said so far. The question I had was that prior pandemics have exacerbated inequalities and concentrated power. The global north is spending itself out of crisis. So, we can talk about conditionalities to the money that's being spent. But the global south doesn't have that kind of money to spend. And they will not be able to spend themselves out of what's hitting them. And that doesn't really bode well for conservation or biodiversity, or a shift away from an extractive economy. So I was wondering what your thoughts might be about how this challenge could be addressed.
Well, I mean, again, you're putting the finger just where it hurts. Obviously, a recovery is not going to be possible if it's not global. And the idea of saying that the rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to stay poor is just, it's just too sad to contemplate. I mean, there's been talks about the debt to the third world, which could be to rapidly industrializing countries, which could be forgiven. I mean, I think that when we see the amount of money being put into the economy of the West, sounds like not necessarily a bad idea. It could be a good use of our money. The idea of reinforcing natural capital in parts of the world where it is needed strikes me as being enlightened. However, it has democratic problems. How do we impose yet again a solution to the rest of the world? Prosperity has been created over the years by the exploitation of some people by others. You just create this notion that some people are not worth it and some people are worth it, so you exploit them so that you can get richer. This is unsustainable and it cannot happen. Our duty in the new enlightened future is that everybody should be allowed the chance of developing. And I don't mean just developing countries against developed countries. I mean also within our own society. Everybody should be getting a fair chance. And that means a complete rethink of how you're going to be able to provide this prosperity. So the idea that every country on the planet is giving a little bit of money to the developing world so that they stay in their dependency status is obviously wrong. It's never worked. So let's try to do it differently. Let's try to unleash a little bit of entrepreneurship. Let's try to use new technologies to create new pockets of innovation where it is actually needed. I mean, one of our new partners is the Africa Leadership University, where we're trying to develop leaders to address the developments in Africa issue. And we have this metric where we talk about 1 billion people in Africa in age of working, i.e. between 15 and 60, in 10 years' time. And what are we going to do with these 1 billion people? It's absolutely impossible to not employ them. So they need development locally, and that development locally has to be done for Africans, by Africans, with Africans. And this whole notion of helping the developing world is not a question of philanthropy again. It's a question of providing people the opportunity to develop. And so the future is much more about entrepreneurship than it is about inequalities. That's the way I would address it.
Thank you, André. And the last question, or should I say the last set of questions, because the majority of questions were on this topic. It's about engaging with business as a force for good. How are we going to get there? How many of the business are interested? There were many questions, Marco, Richard, Romain, Angela, but I'm going to give the floor to Ibrahima because he had a long and complex question. There we go, Ibrahima, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, André. I'm going to be brief. My question is about the role of business, because we all know that major business now have a very powerful impact on the world, and not only good impact. Now, I think you have touched on the idea of triple bottom line, so profits, environment, and social, and I think that's not new. So I have two questions for you, one for the businessman and one for the citizen. As a businessman, do you think major companies are doing what is necessary to really have the paradigm shift that we need in terms of making progress on the triple bottom line? And as a citizen, do you think our societies are really moving forward with that idea? Thank you very much.
Well, first, it's nice to hear your voice. I cannot see you, but nice to hear from you again. First of all, I think a citizen and a businessman can be the same person. I mean, I don't think we should make a distinction there. We are all citizens of the planet. We're all in this together. So I think that's an important proviso. I think that the idea that businesses can provide an opportunity to allow people to shape their own future is important. We need to be able to create conditions and surroundings for allowing every talent to develop wherever that talent happens to be. And we're going to need that because, the planet is growing in terms of population rather quickly. And if we don't increase our creativity, we're not going to be able to meet these challenges. We are going to need to do more with less. And doing more with less is only going to be per person, is only going to be possible if we invent new solutions. The solutions that we have experimented in the West are not functioning, or rather, they're not functioning as well as they used to, for obvious reasons. And that's something we need to address. And for that, we need new types of thinking. And these new types of thinking will be born in places which are not as tired as we are, because not that tide has a feeling in it of being justified. This is when I say tide, I mean à bout de course in French. We just don't really know what's going to happen next. Now, to your question, are businesses doing the right thing? The answer is obviously no. I mean, we need to step our game up considerably. Some of the enlightened companies are starting to do that, but most of the international businesses still have a bit of learning to do. And I think that's a suitable place for all MAVA partners to focus a bit of their attention in the future. You need to talk to the people who really are going to make a difference in the system in which you are. And to get to that system change, we're going to have to influence businesses. Okay, at the moment, governments in the last 3 months have bought a new seat at the table. They've put so much money into the economy that in many ways they are the new owners of what's happening. So I think that in the next 5 years, we're probably going to have to do more lobbying at public administration level rather than just at business level. But in the meantime, these businesses will have to show that they are resilient. And for me, this word resilience is the summary of what we've been discussing. You have humanity, you have a small thing called a virus, which is not even able to survive on its own. It suddenly destroys humanity. Humanity cannot do anything else than sit and cry. We just been locked, all of us, 3 months at home. Because the system itself is not resilient enough. So the new generation of businesses are going to have to do two things. They're going to have to continue to create value that can be shared equally, and I insist on the word equally. And they're also going to have to create more complexity to the business model in order to increase the stability and the resilience of the operating models. And that's an absolutely key word. I'll give you an example. Food production in the US. I've recently heard that the totality of today's cows and beef in the US come from 2 bulls who died in the late 70s. I mean, if that's not weakness, I really don't know what. Obviously, something major could happen at any moment. Potatoes in Peru, there are about 3,000 the potatoes in Peru, and only 3 are being commercially used. We need to put a different hat on. But as a citizen and as a businessman, I think it is important to maintain the branch on which I am sitting. So if I am not doing something for the group as a whole, if I'm not doing something for humanity as a whole, my company will eventually disappear. And that's why it's important to mix the two duties.
To continue with our maybe end with a more general question, broader question, I'd like to call on Frank Cécily from University of Burgundy.
So my question, André, was to what extent do you see education, democracy, and gender equity as contributed directly to environmental resilience?
Hi, Frank. Nice to see you. Absolutely crucial. I mean, this is the central point of what we're saying here. We cannot just compartmentalize this. You should ask the race equality as well in the same mix. What the Black Lives Matter in the US are demonstrating is that it is impossible to have a stable society if we do not put a lot of importance to all these factors. Sustainability has to be taken into account: social, environmental, humans, governance and financial things. The reason there is a pressure on the environment is because we have an unequal system. So we need to create equality before we can start addressing the pressure on the environment. The question is that we need to do so many things in so little time. We need to address so many different issues. It's burning everywhere. At the moment, we have this sanitary crisis, this health crisis. We have political crisis. Everybody hates each other. Nationalism is everywhere, inside countries and outside. And among countries, we have the financial crisis. How are we ever going to repay all this? We have, I think, also quite importantly, a psychological crisis. The future is uncertain. It's very difficult to build something stable on such an incredibly fast-moving environment. And all of this will only be addressed if we reinstate equality. For me, the most important word into all this is that stability is complexity, it's equality. That's where we want to go. So thanks for the question, because it's absolutely crucial. It is linked,
Thank you so much, André. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you for those fabulous questions. Thank you, André, for agreeing to be in the hot seat for just a little bit over an hour and taking all of the questions. As I said earlier, if there are questions we didn't get to in the chat or the ones that you sent in advance, we will make sure that those get answered in one way or another. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Great to see you all here. Fabulous to see all your smiling faces. Thank you, André. And now we say goodbye. This is the sad moment when we say goodbye.